The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the dense forest. Birds chirped in the treetops, and the air was fresh with the scent of morning dew. It seemed like an ordinary day, peaceful and quiet, until something unexpected shattered the stillness. Deep in the woods, a stray dog trotted through the thick underbrush. His fur was matted, his ribs faintly visible beneath his coat, a clear sign that he had been fending for himself for a long time. But despite his rough appearance, there was something different about him, something instinctual, something almost heroic. He had no home, no owner to call his own, but he carried a heart full of loyalty and a nose that could sense danger from miles away. As he moved through the trees, sniffing the ground for any trace of food, he suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and his dark eyes locked onto something ahead. A faint, almost imperceptible sound carried through the trees, a whimper. At first, it was so soft that it almost blended with the rustling leaves. But then, there was again, a small, fragile cry. Not an animal, not a bird, something else, something human. The dog tilted his head, listening closely. His instincts took over, guiding him forward. He carefully made his way through the undergrowth, weaving through branches and stepping over fallen logs, until he reached a small clearing. And that's when he saw her, a baby, lying on the cold earth, wrapped in nothing but a thin blanket, was a newborn. Her tiny hands twitched, her little face scrunched up as she let out another weak cry. She was so small, so vulnerable, completely alone in the middle of the wilderness. The dog stepped closer, sniffing the air around her. She smelled different, nothing like the creatures of the forest. She smelled human. She smelled helpless. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching her. His deep brown eyes studied the frail bundle in front of him. It was as if he understood that this little life was hanging by a thread, that she needed someone, anyone, to help her. And he was the only one there. The wind blew gently, rustling the trees around them. The dog glanced around, ears flicking, but there was no one else. No mother, no father, no sign of where she had come from. She had been left there, abandoned, left to face the cold and the dangers of the wild alone. And then, without hesitation, the dog did something incredible. He stepped forward, gently nudging the baby with his nose. She whimpered again, her tiny fingers curling. He could feel the chill in the air, could sense her shivering. Without a second thought, he lay down beside her, curling his body protectively around the fragile infant. His fur, though rough, provided the only warmth she had. Time passed, but no one came. The baby's cries grew softer, weaker. The dog lifted his head, his eyes scanning the empty forest. He knew he couldn't just sit there. He had to do something. He had to act before it was too late. What happened next would defy all odds. But before we get to that, let's take a moment to ask, how did she end up here? And more importantly, what did this stray dog do that would change everything? Stay with us as we uncover the rest of this incredible story, one of survival, of instinct, and of a hero no one expected. The dog's breath was warm against the baby's fragile skin as he curled around her, his body shielding her from the cold. The forest around them was eerily silent now, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. He could hear his own heartbeat, steady and strong, as he listened closely for any sign of danger. But there was nothing, no footsteps, no voices, no clue as to where the baby had come from or who might be looking for her. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny fingers twitching against his fur. The dog nudged her again, carefully, as if trying to reassure her that she wasn't alone. But he knew, deep in his instincts, that just keeping her warm wouldn't be enough. She needed help. She needed more than what he could give. And so, with a final glance at the dark trees surrounding them, he made a decision. Carefully, he lowered his head and took the edge of the thin blanket in his teeth. It smelled faintly of something familiar. Human warmth, maybe even love once, but it was soaked with cold now. With a gentle but firm grip, he began to pull, slowly dragging the baby across the forest floor. It was not an easy task. The uneven ground, the thick roots, the fallen leaves. Everything seemed to work against him. But he didn't stop. His paws moved steadily, his body tensed with determination. Every few steps, he paused to check on her, making sure she was still breathing, still holding on. The baby let out a weak, soft cry, but he didn't let go. He pressed forward, his nose twitching, searching for something, anything that could lead him to help. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time felt strange in the middle of the woods, where everything blended together into one endless stretch of trees and shadows. But then, through the dense underbrush, something changed. A scent hit his nose. It was faint at first, but then it grew stronger. Smoke. Not the kind that meant danger, but the kind that meant people. Fire. Warmth. Humans. The dog's pace quickened. His legs ached, his body was tired, but he didn't slow down. He followed the scent, weaving through the trees, his ears alert for any sound. And then, finally, he saw it. A light, flickering through the darkness. A cabin. It was small, tucked away between the trees, but it was there. Smoke curled from a chimney. A faint glow from a lantern flickered through the window. Someone was inside. The dog stopped just a few feet away, panting. His eyes darted between the cabin and the baby, still bundled in the thin, damp blanket. He could hear voices now, low, murmuring, the sound of people talking inside. He didn't know who they were, but he knew one thing for sure. They were the only chance she had. With a deep breath, he stepped forward, dragging the baby closer. His nails scratched against the wooden porch as he climbed the steps, his movements careful but urgent. Then he did something he hadn't done in a long time. He barked. It was sharp, loud, cutting through the night like an alarm. Inside, the voices stopped. There was a moment of stillness, then the sound of footsteps, quick and uncertain. The door creaked open, and a figure appeared in the doorway, holding a lantern. An old man. His face was lined with years of hard work, his hands rough and weathered. His eyes, though, were kind, filled with surprise as they landed on the dog, and then widened in shock when he saw what the dog had brought. "Dear Lord," the man breathed, stepping forward. He knelt down, his hands shaking slightly as he reached for the bundle. He lifted the baby carefully, his expression shifting from confusion to urgency. "Mary," he called over his shoulder. "Come quick." A woman appeared behind him, her hair tied back, worry etched into her features. The moment she saw the baby, she gasped, "Oh my, where did she come from?" The man shook his head, looking down at the dog. The dog stared back, his dark eyes steady, as if willing the man to understand. He had done his part. Now it was up to them. The woman gently took the baby into her arms, cradling her close as she rushed inside. The man lingered for a moment, his gaze still fixed on the dog. "You brought her here?" he asked, almost as if expecting an answer. The dog didn't move, didn't look away. He didn't need to speak for the man to know the truth. "Come on, then," the man said finally, stepping aside. "You'd best come in too." For the first time in a long time, the dog hesitated. He had been alone for so long, wandering without a place to belong. But now, as he looked past the man into the warm glow of the cabin, he felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally found where he was meant to be. And yet, even as he stepped inside, even as the warmth of the fire replaced the cold of the night, one question still lingered. Who had left the baby in the woods? And why? Because somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the trees, the answer to that question was waiting. And it was far from over. The warmth of the cabin was a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. The dog sat near the door, his body still tense, ears perked. His dark eyes followed the old man as he moved quickly across the room, gathering blankets, his hands slightly unsteady as he watched his wife cradle the fragile infant. The woman rocked the baby gently, her face filled with concern. "She's ice cold, Thomas," she murmured, wrapping the baby in layers of warm cloth. "Who would leave her out there like that?" Thomas shook his head, his brows furrowed. "I don't know, Mary. But if this dog hadn't found her," he let the sentence hang in the air. The reality was clear. The baby wouldn't have survived much longer. The dog lowered his head slightly, his ears twitching at their voices. He didn't understand all of their words, but he understood their tone. The worry, the urgency, the need to protect. It was the same feeling that had driven him through the forest, that had made him pull the baby from the cold ground and bring her here. The baby stirred, letting out a faint whimper. Her tiny fingers curled around Mary's sleeve, clinging to the warmth, the comfort. Mary's heart ached. She ran a gentle hand over the baby's head, feeling the soft, delicate skin. "Who are you, little one?" she whispered. "Where did you come from?" The question lingered, unanswered. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. The dog lifted his head, his eyes scanning the door, his instincts still sharp. Something didn't feel right. The forest had been too quiet. No scent of a mother nearby. No sign of anyone searching. Someone had left the baby there on purpose. But why? Thomas sat down heavily, running a hand through his graying hair. "We have to tell someone," he said, his voice firm. "The sheriff. He'll need to know." Mary hesitated, looking down at the baby. "And what if no one comes forward?" she asked softly. What if she was left because someone wanted her gone? The thought made Thomas's jaw tighten. It was a terrible thing to consider, but the truth sat heavy in the air. The baby had been abandoned. Not lost. Not misplaced. Abandoned. The dog shifted on his paws. His sharp ears caught something outside, a rustling, faint but distinct. He turned his head sharply, eyes locked on the door. A noise. Someone was out there. He stood up suddenly, letting out a low growl. Thomas and Mary exchanged glances, their expressions tightening. Thomas grabbed the lantern and stepped toward the door, his hand resting on the handle. The dog moved forward, his body tense, muscles coiled. He didn't like this. Not one bit. Thomas slowly opened the door, the wind rushing in as he held the lantern high. The darkness outside was thick, the trees swaying in the night breeze. For a moment, there was nothing, just the forest, the silence. Then a shadow, a figure moving between the trees. The dog barked sharply, stepping forward onto the porch, his fur bristling. The figure froze. "Who's there?" Thomas called out, his voice steady, firm. No answer. Mary held the baby closer, her heart pounding. She could feel it now, that unsettling feeling, the sense that something was wrong. The dog let out another growl, his instincts on high alert. He knew danger when he smelled it. And something about this presence in the woods, it wasn't right. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. Thomas exhaled sharply, gripping the lantern tighter. "Someone was watching," he muttered. "They were right there." Mary shuddered, holding the baby even closer. "You don't think it was the person who left her?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked down at the dog, who was still staring into the woods, his body rigid with tension. "I don't know," Thomas admitted finally. "But I don't like this." He turned back inside, closing the door firmly behind him, locking it. The dog stayed by the door listening. He wasn't convinced the danger had passed. Mary looked down at the baby, who had fallen asleep in her arms, her tiny chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. "We can't let anything happen to her," she whispered. Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "We won't." But even as he spoke, even as the warmth of the fire flickered in the room, the feeling of unease didn't fade. Because out there, beyond the trees, someone knew. And they weren't gone. Not yet. The night stretched on, heavy with an uneasy silence. The baby slept soundly in Mary's arms, wrapped tightly in warm blankets, but the weight of unanswered questions pressed down on both her and Thomas. The dog remained near the door, his ears twitching at every small creak of the wooden cabin. He wasn't resting. He was waiting. Thomas sat by the fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts racing. The shadow in the woods hadn't been a trick of the light. Someone had been there, watching, lurking just beyond sight. And whoever they were, they hadn't come forward. They hadn't called out. They hadn't searched for the baby. That meant one thing. They weren't looking for her. They were hiding. The fire crackled, and Thomas exhaled sharply. "I'm going to the sheriff in the morning," he said, his voice low. "Whoever left her out there, they might still be close. And I don't like the thought of them skulking around in the dark. Mary clutched the baby closer, her expression tightening. What if they come back before then? The dog lifted his head at that, as if he too had the same question. Thomas hesitated, his grip tightening on the arm of his chair. He didn't answer because he didn't have an answer. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the trees, sending a soft whistle through the cracks in the cabin walls. The dog stood suddenly, his ears snapping forward. His eyes locked on the door. Then a sound, a soft scrape against the wooden porch. Thomas shot to his feet, grabbing the lantern. Mary's breath caught in her throat. The dog's growl rumbled low and deep, the sound vibrating through his chest. He stepped forward, muscles tense, eyes sharp. Thomas moved cautiously to the door, pressing his ear against the wood. Nothing. Then another sound, this time softer, like footsteps retreating into the night. His fingers hovered over the lock. Every instinct told him to keep the door shut, but another part of him, stronger, more desperate, told him to look, to know. Slowly, he unlatched the lock and pulled the door open just enough to hold the lantern outside. The golden glow illuminated the porch, the wooden steps, the trees beyond. But the forest was still, empty. Then he saw it, a piece of paper, half crumpled, placed carefully on the ground just beyond the steps. The dog stepped forward, sniffing the air, his body still rigid with caution. Thomas hesitated before bending down and picking it up. The paper was damp from the night air, the edges rough. He turned it over and held it close to the light. Just a few words were scrawled in hurried, uneven handwriting. She was never meant to be found. Thomas felt his chest tighten. A chill ran through him, colder than the wind against his skin. He read the words again, his mind struggling to make sense of them. Mary, still holding the baby, stepped closer. "What does it say?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thomas hesitated before reading the message aloud. Mary paled. Her grip on the baby tightened. Who would write that? The dog let out a sharp bark, stepping off the porch, his nose to the ground. He knew the scent was fresh. Someone had been here, standing right outside their door, close enough to touch the walls of the cabin. And they had left that message. Thomas swallowed hard, scanning the dark tree line. His heart pounded in his chest. "They're watching us," he muttered. Mary's breathing quickened. "Thomas, we have to do something. We can't just—" A sudden rustling in the distance cut her off. The dog snapped his head up, growling, his fur bristling along his spine. And then, through the shadows, they saw it. A flicker of movement. A figure stepping between the trees. Too far to see clearly, but close enough to feel the weight of their presence. Watching. Waiting. Thomas clenched his jaw, his pulse hammering. Whoever this was, they weren't just passing through. They weren't just leaving a message. They were here for a reason, and they weren't leaving. The figure in the trees didn't move closer, didn't call out. They just stood there, half hidden in the darkness, watching. The dog's growl deepened, his body rigid as he took a step forward. Thomas felt his grip tighten on the lantern, his pulse hammering in his ears. This wasn't just someone passing through. This was someone who had been waiting for the right moment. Mary clutched the baby, her breath shaky. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Close the door." But Thomas didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on the shadow beyond the trees. He wanted to call out, to demand answers, but something in his gut told him it wouldn't matter. Whoever this was, whatever they wanted, they weren't going to explain themselves. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. The dog barked sharply, lunging forward a few steps as if ready to chase, but Thomas reached down, gripping the thick fur at the back of his neck. "No," he said firmly, though his voice was tight. "Not yet." The figure was gone, but the message remained, as clear as the cold night air. This wasn't over. Thomas finally stepped back, shutting the door and locking it. His hands were shaking. He hated feeling powerless, hated the way fear crept into his bones like the winter chill. He turned to Mary, who was staring at him, her arms wrapped protectively around the baby. "They were watching us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just standing there. What do they want?" Thomas didn't answer right away. He didn't know. But the note in his hand, The one that read, "She was never meant to be found," felt heavier now. He sat down at the table, flattening the paper against the wood, staring at the rushed, uneven handwriting. Something about it felt desperate, almost as if it had been written in fear rather than malice. He traced the words with his finger, trying to piece it together. Mary sat down across from him, still holding the baby. "Thomas, what if this isn't just about someone abandoning her? What if," she swallowed hard, "what if she was taken?" The thought sent a sharp jolt through him. Taken. Not unwanted. Not discarded. Stolen. His mind raced. It would explain why no one had come looking for her. Why there had been no frantic voices calling her name in the forest. It would explain the shadow in the woods, the message, the way someone had come back not to claim her, but to warn them. Thomas exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. If that's true, he met Mary's eyes. Then someone is going to come back for her. Mary gripped the baby tighter, shaking her head. "No, we can't let that happen." The baby let out a tiny sound in her sleep, unaware of the danger pressing in around her. The dog sat near the door again, ears alert, his eyes locked on the window as if he was waiting for something. Watching for the moment everything would change. And, deep down, Thomas knew. It was only a matter of time. The cabin was silent except for the crackling fire and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. Mary held the baby close, rocking her gently, her mind racing. Thomas sat across from her, still gripping the note, his eyes fixed on the words. The dog remained by the door, his body tense, his ears twitching at the faintest sound. The baby stirred in Mary's arms, her tiny fingers curling around the fabric of the blanket. She had no idea of the fear that had settled over the small cabin, no idea that someone, maybe the person who had abandoned her, was still out there. Thomas took a deep breath. "I can't sit here and wait," he muttered. "If someone's coming for her, we need to act first." Mary looked up, worry flashing in her eyes. "What are you thinking?" "I'm taking this note straight to the sheriff," Thomas said firmly. "And I'm not waiting until morning." Mary hesitated, her grip on the baby tightening. "But what if?" "I'll take the dog with me. You stay here. Lock the doors. Don't open for anyone but me." The dog perked up at his name, as if he understood. His body tensed, ready to move. Mary nodded, though fear lingered in her eyes. "Be careful," she whispered. Thomas grabbed his coat and hat, tucking the note into his pocket. The dog followed him to the door, eager, alert. Thomas threw one last glance at Mary and the baby before stepping into the cold night. The wind howled as he made his way down the path toward town. The dog stayed close, his breath visible in the freezing air. Thomas walked fast, his mind racing. If the baby had been taken, if someone had hidden her in the woods for a reason, then whoever left that note had tried to warn them. But were they warning him? Or warning him to stay out of it? The sheriff's office was dark when Thomas arrived, but he banged on the door until a lantern flickered to life inside. A few moments later, Sheriff Douglas pulled open the door, rubbing his eyes. "Thomas? What in the—" Thomas didn't wait. He shoved the note into the sheriff's hands. "I found a baby in the woods," he said. "And someone's been watching us." The sheriff's eyes widened as he read the note. "A baby?" Thomas nodded, quickly explaining everything. The dog's discovery, the figure in the woods, the note. Sheriff Douglas straightened, suddenly alert. "Where is she now?" "With Mary, at home," Thomas said. "I didn't want to leave her alone, but we need to know who did this. If someone's looking for that child, they're not the only ones," the sheriff cut in. His face was grim as he grabbed his coat. "There was a report a few days ago. A woman traveling through town. She was hysterical, claiming someone had taken her baby. No one took her seriously. She was from out of town, had no family here, and she was barely able to speak through the panic." Thomas felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. "Where is she now?" The sheriff grabbed his keys. "She left town. Said she couldn't stay knowing no one would help her." Thomas stared at him. "Then we need to find her." The sheriff didn't argue. Within minutes, they were riding out toward the next town, where the woman had last been seen. The dog sat at Thomas's feet, staring out into the night, as if he knew they were heading towards something important. Hours later, they found her. She was staying in a small roadside inn, her face pale and hollow with grief. When she saw the sheriff and Thomas step inside, her eyes filled with fresh tears. Thomas stepped forward, his voice gentle. "I think we found your baby." The woman let out a sharp, broken gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. Where is she?" "She's safe," Thomas assured her. "But we need to know what happened. Why was she left out there?" Tears spilled down her cheeks as she struggled to find the words. "I was running," she whispered. From him, Thomas and the sheriff exchanged glances. "My husband," the woman continued. "He was dangerous, controlling. He didn't want me to leave. And when I tried to escape with my baby, he chased me." Her hands trembled. "I hid her in the woods, just for a moment, just to lead him away. But when I came back, she was gone." Her voice cracked with grief. "I searched everywhere. No one would believe me. I thought I lost her forever." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Someone must have found her first. But instead of helping, they left her there. The sheriff straightened. "That means whoever wrote that note knew about your husband." The woman wiped her tears, her expression suddenly filled with fear. "If he finds out she's still alive." "We won't let that happen," Thomas said firmly. "Come with us?" The ride back was tense. The woman clutched her hands together the whole way, her eyes flicking to the darkness around them as if she expected something, or someone, to appear. When they finally reached the cabin, Mary was waiting at the door, the baby cradled in her arms. The woman let out a sob the moment she saw her child. She stumbled forward, her hands shaking as she reached for her. Mary, tears in her own eyes, gently placed the baby into her mother's arms. The baby stirred, then blinked up at her mother, as if recognizing her warmth, her scent. The woman sobbed, clutching her child tightly. "Oh, my sweet girl," she whispered. "I thought I lost you." Thomas stepped back, exhaling slowly. The sheriff was already pulling out his notepad, making plans to track down the husband. But Thomas only had eyes for the dog, who sat beside him, watching everything unfold. "You found her," Thomas murmured, scratching behind the dog's ears. "You saved her." The dog leaned into his touch, his tail wagging softly. Mary walked over, slipping her hand into Thomas's. "She's safe now," she whispered. Thomas nodded, watching the mother and child. "Yeah," he said. "She is." The wind outside had quieted. The cabin, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now felt warm again. Whole. The baby was no longer lost, and thanks to a dog with a heart as strong as his instincts, she had found her way back home.